So welcome to this keynote seminar with Eduardo Cadava. Eduardo Cadava and Sara Nadal-Melsió have created a masterpiece, an exquisite book that represents an experience in itself, an experience of reading in collectivity that opens up a whole universe of solidarity, of critical thought, of praxis, of passion, of beauty. The book embodies a world of reading and writing in full 3 dimensions that gives life to a whole universe of practice. 3 dimensions, first, through a journey of reading the writings of Frederic Jameson, Walter Benjamin, Rosa Luxemburg, W.E.B. Du Bois, Cedric Robinson, and others in conversation with the writings of Marx and Engels. Second, through the creation of a community of critical thinkers and doers that we become part of as we read and enter this universe. And third, through an aesthetic experience that is perfectly curated with stunning reproductions of artwork, a spectacular book design, and a sensibility even to the touch, to the materials. This red book transforms the reader, the toucher, the thinker, the actor. The book describes, but at the same time itself constitutes, what Eduardo Cadava and Sara Nadal-Melsió call a red commonwealth. It elaborates, it instantiates, it breathes life into a common space that serves, in their words, to counter the violence of global capitalism, and that helps us guide towards a possible future. Of this future, they write, if its contours are traced in the skies and the stars, it is because we have yet to realize it on Earth. Nonetheless, its outline can be glimpsed in revolutionary moments and especially in revolutionary texts. The texts that the authors read and write become forms of resistance, forms of critique that come to constitute what they call a crack or fissure that interrupts, destabilizes, and suspends the brutalities of our present world. The Red Commonwealth, then, is both a common wealth, a wealth held in common with the dash, and also a commonwealth, like the frontispiece image of Marx and Engels' doodles of the many little heads of people, resembling but transforming the famous Hobbes frontispiece of the Leviathan. The Red Commonwealth is a collective of texts, an archive, a collection, that in reading and writing about, Eduardo and Sara transform into a wellspring of practice. In the writings of Benjamin, Luxemburg, Du Bois, this Red Commonwealth turns into, in their words, new coalitions among ever-expanding acts of resistance. This book is about reading together as a form of resistance, of revolution, of political insurgency. It's about solidarity, about association, the term that Marx uses to speak of collaborative, cooperative work, a commonwealth of associated producers, as they say, in Marx's phrase. A form of common, shared existence and a horizon. Of central importance to the book is the way in which the discussion of Marx, Benjamin, Luxemburg, and Jameson lead into an extended discussion of race and the legacy of slavery. The point of departure is a short passage from Jameson in which it's said that the reason socialism didn't flourish in America is because of race. It's a passing reference, a short passage that only mentions race, but on its basis, Eduardo and Sara develop an extensive discussion of the history and theory of race conflict in the United States, and an expansive reading of W.E.B. Du Bois, Cedric Robinson, American Slavery, the murder of George Floyd, the summer 2020 protests, the struggle for racial equality, all of which come to form the heart and the core of their readings and writings of our Red commonwealth. The book, Politically Read, is really a magnificent reading of Marx and his interlocutors, an archive embedded in a gallery of images gorgeously reproduced that are inspiring and mobilizing in their beauty and evocative. It's an actually aesthetic experience to handle the book. Every design dimension is thought through. The texture of the white indented cover. I see you have a copy there. You can pass it around maybe to others. The way in which Andy Warhol's silkscreen is superimposed on that cover page hangs like a painting. The red color of the edges of the book pages, the texture of the paper, the ink print, the reproductions of the images, and the images themselves, which are stunning. Everything about the book creates an experience for the reader. Every aspect of the physicality of the book enhances the experience of reading and writing and offers an entry point into the read commonwealth. It's truly spectacular. You'll notice, even the binding, it's sewn. It's not just glued. These are details that people who live with books and in books pay close attention to, because it changes the way that the book opens. It changes how the pages turn. It changes how the seam bends. Some may think that's just details, but what that would miss is the whole experience that the reader enters into when they start reading this book. The texture of the cover, which is what, of course, the reader holds in their hand, gives life to the read commonwealth. The point is, this is a work of art and a treasure by means of which one enters, reading together, a space of practice, of hope, of imagination for the future, for a society, quote, of associated producers and a, quote, world of created labor. So it's absolutely thrilling to welcome Eduardo Cadava back to the 1313 series. Eduardo is, as you all know, a close friend and a colleague to many of us here. He's the Philip Mayhew Professor of English at Princeton University, a member of the Departments of Comparative Literature, Spanish and Portuguese, of Architecture, among others, and he's the author of many books, including Words of Light, Theses on the Photography of History, Emerson and the Climates of History, and others. And his most recent book, before Politically Read, was Paper Graveyards, also published by MIT Press, and also a work of art. His co-author, Sara Nadal-Melsió, is the Associate Director of the Whitney Independent Study Program and the author, most recently, of a book that just appeared with University Press, Princeton University Press, Europe and the Wolf, Political Variations on a Musical Figure. It's a privilege to have you here with us, Eduardo. Thank you so much, to discuss more than the book, maybe to discuss the Red Commonwealth. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bernard. Thank you so much, Bernard. And on behalf of both Sara and I, thank you for this invitation to be able to talk about the book. I should talk about the book first for a little bit? Okay.
Yes. Tell us about how it came into being.
Okay.
And I'll share mine.
Well, the book was, it was never planned to be a book. I was invited, I'm on the editorial board of Cultural Critique, and I was invited by the board to do a review of Fred Jameson's book on Benjamin, the Benjamin Files, which appeared on Election Day, November 2020. Aside from the fact that I always hardly ever do anything that the board asks me to, usually it's just my schedule, I really dislike doing reviews. I've only done 2 in my life. And so this was just going to be, I felt It's Fred Jameson. It's in the twilight of his career. He writes finally his book on Benjamin, and he publishes it on election day. And I felt I also wanted to finally say yes to something that I was being asked to do by the board, because I cherish that affiliation. And so I said yes, but it was in the middle of the pandemic. I was asked to do it in the summer of, actually in the summer of 2020. And the book came out in November of that year. So I was asked earlier. I did say yes. The book came out. Months went by. I wasn't really getting a lot of traction on thinking about it. I didn't really start it. And so at a certain point I thought, well, maybe if I invite someone to help write the review, if they collaborate, we can have a conversation, and maybe I can get started on it. So I asked my friend Sara if she would be interested in doing this. She said, well, why don't you send me the book, I'll read it, and we can have a conversation. So I sent the book. She read it, and we then had a conversation for 2.5 hours, and it seemed clear that we had some things to say. It was supposed to be 3,000 to 5,000 words. In 5 weeks, we have 36,000 words. So I said, well, why don't we just let it unfold in the way it seems to want to unfold, and maybe we'll write, I don't know, like a 200-page manifesto on what it means to do politics in the current moment. So jump cut about 20 months later, we have 160,000 words and a 560-page manuscript. So it's a book. And Sara's line, I think, is true, that if we had planned it, it never would have happened. It was, I mean, for all kinds of reasons, but it probably never would have happened. But I think that what might be useful is how it grew, because I think, you know, it was something that was unexpected, both in terms of the collaboration, the time committed to it, and also just how it grew. So I'll just give you a quick kind of thumbnail sketch of the development. And again, it's totally unplanned. It's in 21 sections. It was only in the last 4 months, so 20 months to do it, not counting summers, which means it was really done in about 14, 15 months. So you can imagine just the intensity of the process. This is just an example of how it grows. Bernard already mentioned this. We're starting to write in the spring after 2020. There is this moment. Jameson is talking about the withdrawal of revolutions in the 20th century, about the expansion of American commodification and capitalism. And he says the reason that America is winning is because it's able to bribe the workers. And that's why capital is winning. And he says, and this is how Lenin explained the fact that the voters in Germany voted for Hitler in the 1930s. And he goes, and this could also explain and be an answer to the hoary question of why there has never been socialism in America. Parenthesis. Perhaps the better answer is race. Okay. He doesn't say anything, but the word race jumps out. Right? And Sara points it out, and we were thinking about it, and it's also, it jumps out especially because of what had happened in 2020. So we start thinking about that. While we're thinking about that, a friend of mine, Andrew Cole, says, oh, well, this question, why is there no socialism in America, is a reference to Werner Sombart's book in 1906, Why is there no socialism in the United States? So the next thing we know, we're in Sombart. And then we talk to R.A. Judy, and R.A. Judy says, oh, well, you know, Sombart was doing a journal with Max Weber, and in 1906, the same year he publishes this book, I should say that Sombart's argument is, in fact, that it's not about race. Like, the reason there's no socialism in the US is because of the lure of consumerism and because of the let's say, the rigidity of the two-party system that doesn't allow another party to emerge. But he says explicitly, it's not about race. But then R.A. Judy says, but you know, 1906, he's publishing a journal with Max Weber, and in 1906, they published an essay by W.E. Du Bois. called The Problem of the Negro in the United States. So it's not like he didn't know this. And in fact, he had met Du Bois some years earlier through the intervention of Max Weber at an event in St. Louis. And in fact, he had been thinking about translating the souls of Black folk into German. So this becomes kind of interesting, but all of a sudden, we're not just in Sombart, we're in Du Bois. So all of a sudden, we're in another archive. And all of a sudden, we're in Black Reconstruction. And in Black Reconstruction, which we start reading around questions of, okay, race, Black agency, and also what's been happening in the States in 2020 and afterwards, because of course you might remember in Black Reconstruction, one of the arguments is that the slaves put their tools down, they effect a general strike, and then we can talk more about that moment. It's an amazing moment. It's a very brief moment in this 800-page book. That when they put their tools down and then think about where they're going to go and read the signs of where the winds of freedom are coming from, they eventually decide to join the Northern Army. They put their tools down, they join the Northern Army, and that turns the tide of the war. Right? So it's a question of Black agency. It's also a question of the general strike. And then all of a sudden, we're thinking about the general strike. And if you're thinking about the general strike, all of a sudden, you're in Benjamin's Critique of Violence. We're reading the Critique of Violence. Sara never really liked Benjamin's Critique of Violence very much. We're reading it, and all of a sudden, she says, you know, why does he go to Sorel instead of Luxemburg to talk about the general strike? Sexist. So the little defender of Benjamin that I am, I come up with a little model for reading the essay. Emily Dickinson has a poem. There are 5 versions of the poem. The poem is an elegy sung by a cricket. In the first 3 versions of the poem, the word cricket is in the poem. Last 2 versions, she removes the word cricket from the poem. She finishes the poem, decides to send it to a friend, puts it in an envelope, folds it up, puts it in an envelope along with a dead cricket. Amazing, right? You look at the poem, there's no cricket, but it comes with a dead cricket. So I say, Rosa is the dead cricket. So then we start reading the Critique of Violence as an essay that's organized around the missing body of Rosa Luxemburg, right? And it really works, right? She's encrypted in various figures in that essay, the great criminal, Niobe. There's a way of reading the story of Cora in relation to her as well. And so all of a sudden you see that she's encrypted inside the essay. And there are reasons why, I think. Benjamin, if she's Miss Mass Strike, Benjamin is Mr. Non-Instrumentalization. So Rosa Luxemburg is being instrumentalized at this moment by the right as a terrorist and by the left as a martyr, having been assassinated. And so one way that Benjamin decides he cannot instrumentalize her, one way not to instrumentalize her is to not to mention her name. So it encrypts her. And at a certain point, Sara was still not entirely convinced. She was going along with the reading, but at a certain point, she notices toward the end of the essay that he quotes Kurt Hiller, who's a pacifist, and he quotes a passage from Hiller where Hiller is complaining about the violence of the Social Democrat Party and also about the violence of the Spartacists. But he doesn't mention, it's a passage in Hiller where that's what he's talking about, but when Benjamin quotes the line, he excises the reference to the Spartacists and to the great Bolshevik who's Lenin. So this was the confirmation, finally, that the reading is correct, that he deliberately excises Rosa from that. So we're reading the Benjamin, we're going back to the Marx, we're going to the Sorel, we're going to the Luxemburg, and then all of a sudden we're reading The Accumulation of Capital by Rosa Luxemburg. And as we're reading this, and as we're reading the Du Bois, we encounter the comet, the story of the comet, which some of you may know is a story about a comet that is coming toward the US to New York, and it's about to destroy New York. We can talk about that in the discussion. But we also started reading Les Abendio, which is a sci-fi novel that is given to Benjamin it's a 1913 sci-fi novel. It's given to Benjamin by Sholem as a wedding gift. Crazy, wacko sci-fi novel, a planet called Pallas, with the Pallasians, these sort of elastic creatures that have a kind of weird language, that can turn themselves into radio transmitters, who wear a little collar with all the books that they have, that they can use to share books with other people, read books anytime. And what you see is that he's looking to this sci-fi novel, which he had imagined using in a book called Politics, which he never finished, as a way of trying to imagine different communal forms that have no equivalent on Earth, right? And so as we're reading these things, and actually I'll say that there was no plan until like the last 4 months, where it wasn't that there was a plan, but we knew what materials we wanted to use to close the book. And we wanted to use the second comet, Les Abendio, as a kind of, let's say, sequence. And with Les Abendio, because it's in the heavens, we put it together with Blanqui's Eternity by the Stars. And then we knew that we wanted to read Benjamin's Mexican Dreams and Marx's Ethnological Notebooks. So we then, the last few months, we had a sequence, an order. I will say that one thing that would happen is that each time we would finish a section, we were actually kind of happy about the section, but we were increasingly exhausted by what we were doing, right? So each time we would finish a section, we would almost like, how are we going to write the next one? And how are we going to match what we're doing in some way? But we ended with those 3 sections, one around the comet, the other one around the To the Planetarium and Blanqui, again in the heavens, and then this section that we circulated called A Red Commonwealth. And the Red Commonwealth, as Bernard said, is a kind of idea we came up with, a red commonwealth, which is the commonwealth, this wealth that we all share, that we can draw from as resources to do political work in the present, and in particular anti-racist work, anti-colonial work, anti-capital work, etc. So part of the handout is linked to some passages that we can maybe talk about, but I want to just say maybe a couple more practical things about the process. Everything was based on conversations. Right? I mean, we would talk. I type faster than Sara, so I would take notes. We would share the notes, and then we would each start writing. Her writing is more telegraphic, let's say, than mine. She would send me something, I would then expand, I'd send it back, and she would cut. And then we'd kind of go back and forth like this. We would finish the section, and then we would read everything out aloud. Right, so we would read everything aloud. This was mostly a pandemic book. A lot of this happened remotely. So we would read everything out aloud. There were times, of course, when we would disagree about something. And then we would keep talking until we could find a formulation that we could both accept. So there was a very, let's say, trusting, respectful, process, which I think is what made it work, right? That there was a way in which we never, both of us had an equal voice in how things happen and how they unfolded. And whenever we would decide on having a different section, we would both agree on having that added section. It would feel compelling to us to move in that direction. But this is to say that what happens in that process is that it is, as Bernard said, it's a process of reading. We're thinking about reading. We're thinking about these mostly, I mean, there are more than these 5 figures, but say the main ones are Marx, Luxemburg, Benjamin, Du Bois, and Jameson. And reading them as comrades on the shelf that we can use, again, as resources. And one of the things that we're trying to do is think about the role and place of reading and writing within the political domain, right? Because you would never think that Marx was not a political figure, right? But he writes a lot, right? And in fact, if you read every one of the prefaces to Capital, his anxiety is that people are going to rush to the street to try and change the world before they read his book, right? And reading his book is really hard, right? So that what we were interested in is actually this way in which these figures, every one of them, readers and writers, can begin to do political work at the level of sentences, right? So they're really extremely close readings of the language of each of these writers to try and demonstrate how they're inheriting language, changing the language, recontextualizing it, trying to move it somewhere else as part of the political work that they're doing, right? So this becomes a way of thinking about the relation between theory and practice, the relation between these texts and their political activism. Some years before we were writing this, I had taken Angela Davis to Athens, and she gave a talk. And as she was giving the talk, she would continually interrupt herself. This is where we should read Marx on this. Oh, the best essay on this is this. The best book on this is this. It became really clear that her political activism is inseparable from a labor of reading, right? And this is something that is at the heart of this project, right? The way in which each of these figures engage in readings of the language they inherit. And it's a way of thinking about the importance of language within this project, right? And it doesn't mean that everything that they're talking about can be reduced to language, right? Killing, suffering, violence. It's not that it's reducible to language, but that these things would never happen without language, right? You would never have a war without legislation, commands, arguments put forward to persuade people to die for a cause. So that there's a way in which you'll see one section, the critique of the Gotha program, right? The Gotha program was a program done in the mid-1870s by the Social Democrat Party. They send the draft of the program to Marx, and he basically does a kind of editing job. Like this is vague, this is that, this is this. I mean, no, exaggerated, no, you don't want to be giving them more ammunition. So he basically edits the whole thing, and what you come to understand is he thinks that if you're going to be a good communist, you better be a good writer, right? That there are stakes in how you phrase things, how you write things. And so that this is a kind of thread throughout. I'll just say two more things. One is the way we close the book. Because it was hard to close, as you can imagine. I mean, this process of reading, which shows itself to be a process of multiplication, amplification, proliferation, accumulation, that reading itself is that kind of a process, right? As we went from archive to archive to archive to archive. And this was a way of thinking about the development and growth of something like a Red Commonwealth. We close with a reading of Marx's ethnological notebooks. It's the last thing he's working on before his death. And this is 1879, 1882. And basically these are excerpts of books that he's reading, mostly on different communal forms around the globe. And in fact, a lot of those communal forms having to do with indigenous communal forms, right? So he's scanning the landscape. He's looking at innumerable different possibilities. He's looking for different possibilities for communal forms. He realizes there were a lot of possibilities. Like, it didn't have to end in capital. It didn't have to begin with that violence, right? So that in some way, the way we end is this suggestion that to be communist means to be able to imagine different beginnings and different endings, which is exquisitely beautiful, I think. The other little detail about the ending, and this we can discuss if we can turn to the handout at some point, is linked to the reading of one of Benjamin's Mexican dreams, in which he uses a kind of neologism. Some of you may know Benjamin was learning Nahuatl. He was studying Nahuatl in 1915, 1916. And so he has a second dream. There are two Mexican dreams in One Way Street. In the second dream, he invents a word, we'll look at it later, amicavitsly, which is a word that doesn't mean anything, right? It's a word that doesn't belong to any language, but it's based on his study of Nawadl. And then he breaks the word up into little sections. Ana, ki, vits, li. And he does a kind of break of all of them. But when he breaks it, it says ana, vi, vits. He skips the ki, right? But anyway, what he's suggesting, because if you look at it, it's that Nawadl neologism includes within it Greek, Latin, French, and German, which is kind of wild. So there's a certain point, Sara says, I want the last word in the book to be amicavitsly. And so what we did is we made sure that happened, which is to say that at a certain point we talk about the Red Commonwealth, and we say the Red Commonwealth, which might have as one of its passwords, as one of its shibboleths, the word amicavitsly, which is how we ended, but it's also a way of showing, again, the kind of back and forth between the two of us. We've put the frontispiece of the book up there. Should I talk about it first, or
why don't we come to it in a minute? Yeah,
okay,
we'll come to it in a minute. Perfect. Yeah. That was terrific. Thank you, Eduardo. So you mentioned two particular passages. Maybe I can get my book back at this point, so I can.
Or you can borrow mine.
Or I can borrow yours.
Or yours has all the markings.
And two of my favorite passages, and so I thought maybe we could just stop on those to begin with. The first one was about the Gotha program. I thought that was a marvelous section. It's at page 307 of the book, and it's also in the materials that we distributed, fortunately, so everybody has access to those online as well. It's this description of what he's doing in the Gotha program, and you call it a critical reading protocol. Critical reading protocols. I think that's brilliant. The idea is that Marx was paying attention to every word, every expression that was being used in that platform, and was objecting to kind of the looseness of the terminology, right, and the use of those terms, as we're familiar from the critique, of course, equal right or fair distribution. And you write that the text is further evidence, that's the bottom of the page, the text is further evidence that critical reading protocols are a political practice. For Marx, the possibilities of communism cannot be imagined without committed and even militant readers and writers, with reading and writing not restricted to just linguistic practices, but expanded to include communist strategies for doing political work. And I take it that the way, that ties beautifully to the whole Red Commonwealth, but I was hoping we could explore that idea. So it's the attention to language, the attention to terms, is in a way to protect from criticism. It's this kind of precision, this kind of demand for precision. How does that function? And when you think about it, it's not what one might expect. It's a demand for technicality, for precision, that in a way defies a certain kind of populist politics. It's not looking for the words that are going to resonate necessarily, right? In part, it goes against a certain kind of populist strategy, which would be to try and figure out what are the words that are going to resonate, right? It's much more like that doesn't matter so much as getting everything exactly right conceptually, linguistically, verbally, so as to in part protect, but also to be accurate about the way in which kind of political praxis then is experienced, right? Yeah.
This is interesting because this section, if you were to look at it and see what he's actually doing, I mean, he does painstakingly move through the sentences and the paragraphs, and he does pause on particular words, and he talks about them being imprecise, sloppy, bungled in style and content. I mean, these are quotes, right? Obsolete verbal rubbish, botched quotations, hollow phrases, can be twisted and turned as people like, so this worries him. What becomes interesting, and it's nice that you do this, because it's almost as if he wants to control, right? And this comes where in the same text, he says, every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs, right? So he doesn't think that you can program the future, right? So there's a moment where in a letter to Edward Beazley in the late 1860s, he says, anyone who tries to draft programs for the future is a reactionary, right? So there's a way in which, on the one hand, he thinks you can't program it, you can't force it, and you're absolutely right. What he's doing here is trying to minimize misunderstanding, right? Now, this is interesting because in the readings that we do of him elsewhere, and of the readings we do of Benjamin, Du Bois, etc., one of the ways in which they protect themselves and they try and minimize misunderstanding is in fact by maximizing the citationality of their language, right? They massify their sentences so that if they're massified in some way, it becomes harder to instrumentalize in a particular direction, right? So that one question that could be tracked, and this is one thing I'll say, when you read the book, if you read the book, I hope you look at the book, is that there's nothing that stays the same from one moment to the next, right? You read this passage, but you have to read it in relation to other passages to see what happens, right? Because the meaning of anything doesn't adhere in a single sentence at any point, right? So that part of what gets staged in the unfolding of the argument is the way in which meaning takes time to unfold, right? And that what's required when you read things is reading a kind of almost a loop, a return, how something can be said in one place, but then said something else over here. And it's not that they contradict one another, it's just that you're being asked to read those two things together. So if he's emphasizing precision, at a moment where he's also saying no program, no forcing, no being able to predict how people are going to read, then, and why say real movement is the important thing, no programs, it's because in some way there's a maximization of things that can't be marked, determined in a fixed way, etc. And I think that you have to put those things together in the same way. I mean, this is somebody who is extremely literary. Marx is very literary. Some of you may know this passage from Benjamin's Author and Producer, where he says that to be politically correct, you have to be literarily correct, right? Which is kind of amazing, you know, that you have to, that there's something about the literariness of a critical strategy that becomes a resource, right? Which is why, for example, Marx so often has recourse to literature in order to do political work, right? He reads the Royalists through Balzac. He reads the young Hegelians through Cervantes. This is somebody who gets his children to memorize acts of Shakespeare. He takes them for long walks. He gives them stories. The daughters, in fact, don't even say, tell us another story. They tell him very beautifully, tell us another mile, right? So that there's a way in which, again, why does he have recourse to literature? Why does he see literature as a lever to do political work, right? Subcomandante Marcos, at one point, is asked what the best books on political theory are, and he says, Don Quixote, followed by Macbeth and Hamlet, right? So, I mean, this is to say, again, that there is this emphasis on precision, but there's also this wildness having to do with the literary quality of things. And I think that both of those things, how can you be precise about something that is always in motion, always shifting from one moment to the next, What would precision mean there? And in some way, it would be totally interesting to have the Gotha program in front of us and to go and see why he's worried about these moments, because in some way what he's doing is not that he wants to maximize the ambiguity here. What becomes interesting is how is this going to be a program? So he actually edits it, sends it back. Also, when he sends it back, he sends him a copy of the French edition of Capital, and also quotes the Communist Manifesto as if, like, you better read me better if you're going to do this program. But then he says, here it is, it's revised, Engels and I won't sign it, which is kind of interesting too, right? I don't know if that really, I think that it means that you have to kind of read it between this movement, between trying to be precise and also exploiting, or at least acknowledging, the inability to determine or fix in advance, right?
And then a second passage I wanted to just kind of go over with you is at the end of the book, because I think it's a beautiful passage in the penultimate paragraph. So on page 330, also in our materials for everyone that are online. It's a remarkable passage. I mean, it starts about 10 lines into the penultimate paragraph, like Marx, Luxemburg, Benjamin, Du Bois, and all the other writers who in turn evoke in each of their texts and under each of their names this common wealth belongs to the motility of an endless process without a subject. And you go on. I don't know if you'd rather read it than I.
Well, I can read. How far do you want me to go? To the
well,
end of the paragraph?
Yeah, we're never alone. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like Marx, Luxemburg, Benjamin, Du Bois, and all the other writers who in turn evoked in each of their texts and under each of their names, this commonwealth belongs to the motility of an endless process without a subject that will not be silent in front of capitalist violence or shy away from its own violence, that is impossible to transform into dogma or to synthesize into a system, that will demand a reading that exceeds the text in order to make each text a site of encounters and possibility, that risks being political because it knows politics is the only means we have for not only encountering what is incalculable, but also for maximizing it. It is a politics that can never have a determinate or fixed form, and that because of the danger of an almost inevitable complicity with what it believes goes in the direction of the worst, must remain in movement. The task is how to set the masses in motion. And as we have seen, this task is folded into an activity of reading and writing that, accumulating its force through the commonwealth it mobilizes, reminds us that whenever we think and struggle for change, we are never alone. It's a good summary.
It's a beautiful passage. It really captures well, I think,
We can write sentences.
Yes, yeah. But it really captures well what the Red Commonwealth is about,
It does.
it seems to me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it also does a beautiful job, I think, of linking the Red Commonwealth, which is about reading and writing, which turns this whole text into such an extraordinary experience, to the task of setting the masses in motion.
Right. Benjamin at one point says that it's always a question of how to set the masses in motion, right? Or as Brecht says, thinking politically means thinking your thoughts in other people. Thinking politically is the art of thinking your thoughts in other people's heads, right? Emerson's version is a revolution happens when your thought becomes the thought of someone else, right? So that there's this way in which what we're doing is, in the Benjamin Files, there's this glorious moment. We've all read Jameson, right? And you know that he's never been the most beautiful writer. Every once in a while he'll burst into song, but in general, it's tough going. The Benjamin book is exquisitely beautiful. It's just exquisitely beautiful. And there's a way in which, as he's reading Benjamin, as happens with many people who read Benjamin or write on Benjamin, there's a kind of mimetic contagion. You start writing like Benjamin, right? He registers this in the Benjamin Files. and I won't get it exactly correct, but he says that he has entered my head. It's produced a cultural revolution in the practice of my reading. This should be illegal and denounced as such, right? So, but you see that it's a way in which that thought gets in your head and starts altering the way you think, right? And so as we were finishing the book, we discovered this frontispiece. Maybe this is a moment to just talk about the frontispiece a little bit. This is the frontispiece of the book. So you open the book, and the first thing you run into is the frontispiece, which is this. So this is a manuscript page from the thesis on Feuerbach, which of course belongs to what came to be known, because they didn't.
German ideology.
Came to be known as the German ideology. It's not a title that Marx and Engels gave to it, but it's the title that we know that book from, right? So if you can look at it, there are two columns. This is very typical of a manuscript page of Marx and Engels. On the left, the handwriting is Engels. Marx's handwriting is terrible. So usually the handwriting on the left was Engels, Marx's wife Jenny, once in a while some of their friends. But what you see is that the writing on that left column is the result of a collaborative effort. Right? It's the conversations that he's had with Marx, the Engels has had with Marx. It's not just a single voice there, right? On the right, if we blew it up, what you would see is that there's squiggles, little markings. These are Marx's notes on what's written on the left column. And then what Engels does over the course of days, weeks, months, whatever, we know he didn't do it in one sitting, is he does these extraordinary doodles. And if you were to see it and blow it up, they're heads within heads within heads. Right? So that if you think, again, that the task is to think your thoughts in other people's heads, what you see is this process where during the course, again, of days, weeks, months, whatever, you see the slow emergence of a mass through the movement of a pen, which is kind of fantastic, in terms of what we're trying to talk about, the role and place of reading and writing. Because, of course, this book, this text is itself already a reading of several texts. Right? They're reading Feuerbach, they're reading other figures, and so what this text is composed of is already beginning in a scene of reading. Right? They collaborate, they read everything aloud. The anecdote is that as they were writing this, they were laughing so loud that the neighbors were complaining, right? Which is kind of a great thing. But what you see, if you were to look again closely, is you see this slow emergence of a mass of the movement of pen, and however, let's say, amorphous or non-directional it seems, all the heads are facing the left. Right? So there is a kind of directionality to it. And they're not all human faces. They're animals. They're pigs, snakes, dogs, even a ram. And then if you were to blow it up, you'd really see it. There are a couple of these faces, and one maybe even a pig, that moves very faintly over to the other side. So it introduces a kind of movement between the two columns. Right? But what you're witnessing here is the process of their production. Right? Which is really fantastic. I mean, that you actually can see the process of their production. But what you also see, it becomes an emblem for collaboration. It shows that the practice of reading and writing are collaborative processes. This becomes the emblem in some way of our own collaboration. And so the book begins, and this was actually one disagreement that we had, and I surrendered in the end. She was right. How to begin the book. There was a question, should we begin with a frontispiece, a reading of the frontispiece, and then go to a kind of quasi-description of the kinds of things we're going to be doing? Because we don't, in a normal introduction, say, oh, and we do all these things in different sections. We don't do that. And I thought initially, well, maybe we should talk about how the book began and then do the reading of the frontispiece. She was right. It was better to begin with the frontispiece. There's something kind of really strong about beginning with the frontispiece and then going back into the kind of origin story of the book. But you can see it's an example of this collaboration. And I mean, we don't have to go over it, but the first passage on the handout is the text that is written on the left. And if we, you know, I don't know how you want to proceed.
That's great. Let's go
okay,
through
so if you look at the first passage, this is what's written on the left side, right? We shall, of course, not take the trouble to explain to our wise philosophers that the liberation of man is not advanced a single step by reducing philosophy, theology, substance, and all the rubbish to self-consciousness, and by liberating man from the domination of these phrases, which have never held him in thrall. Nor shall we explain to them that it is possible to achieve real liberation only in the real world and by real means, that slavery cannot be abolished without the steam engine and the mule jenny, serfdom cannot be abolished without improved agriculture, and that in general, people cannot be liberated as long as they are unable to obtain food and drink, housing and clothing in adequate quality and quantity. Liberation is a historical and not a mental act, and it is brought about by historical conditions, the level of industry, commerce, agriculture, intercourse. Amazing little passage, right? Now, if you look at it, I mean, they're doing a reading of the young Hegelians. They're talking also about Feuerbach and other figures. And look at what they do with the quotation marks, right? I mean, liberation, self-consciousness, man. I mean, you know what happens when you put things in quotation marks, right? They have these little clothespins basically hanging a concept out to dry, right? So you have, you know, when you have something in quotation marks, you're signaling that you're not using this in the way that maybe somebody else is using it, right? So it's a way of saying that what they're doing is they're engaging the diction of the young Hegelians. They're engaging the diction, the words they're using, and they're saying that there's a lot at stake in how these people use these words. And one of the things they're saying is liberation, which is at stake in the passage, is something that is not arrived at just by thought, right? So there's a way in which whatever they're saying liberation is, real liberation from just verbal liberation, involves something that is linked to historical conditions, to things that have to do with the material circumstances. But it's basically, it's not to say that there's you go the material way, forget the thought. What they mean by liberation, or what they're thinking about, is not just something that would be opposed to thought, but that you reconceptualize that whole distinction, and what you need to think about is thought and materiality as a kind of couple. Right? And so there's a way in which, if you think about what's in this passage, you could say that it's about revolution, it's about slavery, it's about technology, it's about the relation between theory and practice, it's about historical and mental conditions, and it's about subjectivity and personal agency. So basically what you get in this passage is like everything that Marx wants to talk about, Marx and Engels want to talk about. So you have encrypted in this passage basically the rest of his text, right? And it's already here, but again, what's interesting is they never really finish the book. There's a way in which they use it as a resource in later texts. This becomes interesting. I mean, I'm doing a course on Marx and race at the moment. And we just did Sylvia Wynter's Black Metamorphosis. I don't know if any of you know this, but this massive, unfinished, left behind manuscript, kind of like this one, you know, but it's a kind of place that she and they can mine from in other places. But this is just to say that the passage itself, it's not just that, I mean, the other thing to say too about the little squiggles and doodles, since they weren't done all at the same time, who knows, days, weeks, months, they have other conversations, right? So when he comes back and adds more doodles, more heads, those heads have encrypted relations to new conversations and new references, right? So that those heads themselves multiply in terms of the references that are encrypted in those traces. And one of the things that he does too, that very often Engels will take a squiggle from one of Marx's notes and turn that squiggle into a head. which is kind of great, too. But this is to say, again, that it became a kind of emblem, and it's at the beginning of the book, so you have to pass through it to read the book. But in the long run, in order to read it, you have to read the book and then return to it. So this is what I meant earlier about the necessity of a kind of reading loop, which Althusser talks about in Reading Capital, that there has to be a kind of reading loop. You go back to where you began and you read it differently. Yeah.
So we should make sure that anyone who actually wants to jump in at this point should feel free to jump in, if anyone, so I'll be looking around to see.
See, I love these events where, like most of the people haven't read the text, and this happens so often. It's like playing Trivial Pursuit, when you try to remember something you never knew. But I'm happy to
But
talk.
no, the chapter on Red Commonwealth we distributed. So,
Yeah. You read the Red Commonwealth, and then
Oscar,
and these
you
passages on the Mexican dreams, everything.
Grab the mic down, pass it to Oscar, and while Oscar's getting ready. Also, I don't have the I can't read the handwriting, but the relationship between liberation and emancipation would be something we could talk about here. But go ahead, Oscar.
Well, thank you so much. I really loved hearing about the process of writing this book, mostly just because it sounded like a really enjoyable process of
we
getting
laughed
to
a lot.
read. But I hope the neighbors didn't complain. And so I guess I'm just wondering how, when you were writing this final chapter, if you knew going into the process of 14, 15 months, if that's where you want to end up, or if in this multiplicative process, in this sort of a very expansive process, you ended up naturally at the ethnological notebooks and coming back to Benjamin.
We knew we wanted to end with the ethnological notebooks. That we knew. The discovery there, we knew we wanted to use the Mexican dreams. Benjamin's Mexican dreams, which I hope we can talk about. These are kind of fabulous dreams. The discovery, sort of as we were doing it, was the Las Casas, and the discovery that Benjamin actually had a review of a biography of Las Casas. This was kind of extraordinary. And it's a review that's never been translated into English. It's been translated into Spanish and French, but not English. And so that was a discovery. But again, this is what would happen. You get into an archive, and then all of a sudden you start reading around, and you discover things. And Las Casas was a kind of late discovery in some way, because we knew we wanted to do the Mexican dreams and the ethnological notebooks. That was going to be in the last section. So the Las Casas was a kind of great thing that seemed to be echoed by Marx, and also that Marx references. And then all of a sudden, Benjamin also had written a review. And so it was a way of getting back to primitive accumulation, to the violence at the beginning of Capital, extraction, and all of that gets picked up in both the Mexican dreams and the ethnological notebooks. Yeah.
Yes, Jack.
I have a question about the idea of precision, specifically with meaning. One of my questions revolves around when does maybe precision sometimes maybe go antithetical to some of the things we want to strive for? Why are we striving for precision always? And I kind of do this with the backdrop of queerness, for example.
What does?
Queerness, being queer.
Yeah.
It doesn't something kind of pushed against a lot of times the idea of trying to put things into boxes, naming.
Absolutely.
And also really lives with the idea of uncertainty to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
So why are we striving for precision, and how can sometimes precision even hurt aspects of what being human is all about?
Right. That's good, because it takes us back to some of what I said in response to Bernard's earlier evocation of that question. There's in the section on the critique of violence, in this effort to suggest that it's an essay organized around the missing body of Luxemburg, we reproduce an image of Benjamin in drag, 1921 image, discovered in the Berlin archive, the Benjamin archive. The archivist tells me, we don't know the photographer, we don't have copyright, you publish it at your own risk, okay? Now, what we try and track in there, it becomes very interesting because Trotsky at one point, in a kind of eulogy for Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, both of whom were assassinated, right? He refers to her as somewhat masculine and Liebknecht as somewhat feminine. Right, so there are these sort of indeterminacies that emerge in the reading, right? And so this question, and I was trying to hint at this in the answer to Bernard, is it's true. What does that precision mean? What would it mean to be precise? And in some sense, if you follow all the readings, and you know, this is what it is, like one close reading after another, if you follow those readings, precision has at times to do with being as faithful as you can be to the mobility and indeterminacy of a figure, right? So that there's this gorgeous moment in the beginning where we do a reading of this section, a little section in One Way Street called Chinese Curios, where Benjamin is talking about how you copy things, like exactly. And in that copying, you get close to the text. But what you get close to, as he describes it, is exactly the mobility of a text, the mobility of language. So that if I wanted to formalize it and then say that you then have to kind of track it and see how even this is a mobile formulation, I would say that there's a demand for precision, but that precision has to do also with exposing those things that are incalculable, indeterminate, unable to be fixed in a kind of enduring way. Because what each of them are trying to do in one way or another is address historical political circumstances that are shifting from one moment to the next. Right? Thank you for asking that, so I could do that. Yeah.
Angela, you want
You have to look. I mean, if you flip through the book, you have to find that image. Yeah.
It's on page 85.
Yeah.
Yes, Angela. Thank you so much for everything you've shared. It was very poetic. And I just had a question. When you were mentioning this passage and thinking about the liberation concept and the materiality of having thirst, like sufficient food, sufficient clothing,
yeah, right.
To start this liberation process, but and it not being a mental process, but being a historical process.
Right.
But I'm wondering how that perspective could be applied to people who have enough food and have enough clothing, but are not liberated. At that point, like, would it start to be a mental process in terms of people who have like this materiality? Like, because I assume he is talking about people who do not have this materiality as a basis. But
right.
like, how do you envision that for people who?
You mean, and how do they?
Yes.
I mean, Benjamin's a perfect example. He's bourgeois, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, and there's this kind of great moment where Sholem, and we do a reading of this letter that Sholem directs to Benjamin, and he basically says, "Why don't you just stay with metaphysics? I mean, why do you get into these things about communism, these things? What are you doing? I mean, this little red flag that you put out your window or whatever." And Benjamin basically says, "Okay, look, I mean, I live in this neighborhood. I know it's bourgeois, but it's where my little writing factory is. Like, what do you want me to do? Like, can I really escape those things ever, right?" So that what he does is, yeah, because he basically gets accused of being counter-revolutionary by Sholem. And he goes, "Look, okay, I'm counter-revolutionary in relation to the way in which the party would look at me, right? Because I'm not with certain elements of the party. So they would think of me as counter-revolutionary. But that doesn't mean that I want my work to be appropriated by the people who are counter-revolutionary, right? So if I'm pressed and up against the wall, I lean communist, right? So what's interesting is that he's, again, trying to position himself, but position himself without positioning himself in a determinate space, right? But I think that what he's doing is there's this whole question then of can he ever escape his bourgeois condition in order to do what he's doing. There's a very beautiful footnote in the second edition of the Work on Art essay where he's talking about leadership. And he's talking about communal forms and factions and coalitions. And he says that the more determinate it is, the more compact it is, this is a problem. So that what he likes are communities that are kind of loose around the edges. And what he says is the leader, instead of being a leader, should be one of the hundreds of thousands, right? But again, it's like, how does he actually escape those conditions, right? Because one of the things that we're trying to think about is the way in which any act, any reading, any writing is always mediated, right? And it's mediated by your history, by your circumstances, by the place where you are, but the place where you are is not just that place, it's already linked to a whole network of unforeseeably mediated relations, right? So you can't even locate yourself in a particular place. So part of it is also seeing where that position that he has is already traversed by other positions, and how his language is already traversed by all these other voices. I mean, the thing about Benjamin is that he has his community of writers, right? Marx, Kafka, Proust, Krakauer, and they're people that he likes to read, Karl Kraus, etc. He also reads these weird guys like Scheerbart, who writes Les Abendio. And if you read Les Abendio, there are moments which are kind of proto-fascist. But he's somebody who can go into a text and find resources even in counter-revolutionary texts, right? Which is to say that, again, that even somebody, I mean, it's like, what do we, I mean, I own a car. I'm writing this book, but how do you start navigating that, right? And so part of it is, in some way, and this has to do with the impersonality of the agency, right? I mean, I did at one point say, and what he misses is the key, the who. When he's talking about the Nikivitzli, when he divides it into syllables, he doesn't give you the key, which is the who. So what he's really talking about is historical process without subjects, right? And part of that has to do with the impersonality of our agency, which is to say, when we act, we're so acted upon by other forces that we can't really say that we're acting alone. Emerson, in his essay Faith, says, "'Tis fine to say you elect your course as long as you accept an irresistible dictation," right? And so it's nice because then what does it mean to be bourgeois? To be bourgeois is not to just be only bourgeois, right? And that's why he can go into these different texts and find resources in them. And I think this is quite nice. It then gets us to rethink all these terms, all these concepts, and register the mobility within them. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
David, did you want to jump in?
Thank you so much. I especially like the way you used the Frontispiece. It reminded me a lot of Vico and the Scienza Nuova, where you had it already explained as the idea of the work, right?
Right.
But I want to come back more to language and the power of language as a political tool, and especially look at it from two perspectives. So a lot of the people you're talking about, Marx, for example, wrote in English, and Benjamin wrote a lot in French. Translation is kind of the issue I'm thinking about. How did translation influence your work and your analysis, and also the way you looked at the people? Because I know I speak differently in German. I think differently in German than I do in English. And maybe sometimes it was an unconscious, sometimes it was a conscious move, sometimes it was something like a board that dictated them to write, for Marx, for example. How did that influence your vision of it and your work?
That's a good question. I mean, Benjamin is a theorist of translation, right? And the nice thing about the Nikivitzli is that, as I said, it's presumably a Nahuatl word, an invented Nahuatl word. And this Nahuatl word bears within it all these European languages, right? So that it means that Nahuatl is not just Nahuatl, right? And part of it has to do, I mean, you read these sections, so you know that part of it has to do with the way in which Nahuatl was also taught by friars from Europe, from Spain, so that there's a way in which the Nahuatl language, as it gets formalized into a language that can be conveyed and so on, is mediated by other countries. So one of the things that Benjamin says in his theory of translation essay, right, the task of the translator, is that one of the things you encounter when you encounter a translation is the foreignness of all language, including your own, right? So I think that one of the things that, I mean, if you look at the last passage on the handout, I think this is a very perfect example.
Yeah, yeah.
These are from the ethnological notebooks, right? And it's just like, what kind of animal are these notebooks, right? Because he's citing, he's drawing from Lewis Henry Morgan, right? Ancient Society, right? And he's referencing different moments in the ethnological, because he's basically copying. These are excerpts. But look what he does with the excerpts. I mean, he inserts German, he inserts Nahuatl, Spanish, English, all in the same passage. And if you're reading, I mean, he's drawing also, he's doing these things, and little by little, in these passages as he's quoting these excerpts, I mean, he refers to Aeschylus, Demosthenes, and in Greek, he puts the Greek in there, right? So Aeschylus, Demosthenes, Homer, Herodotus, Thucydides, Aristotle, Tacitus, Spencer, you know, Shakespeare, of course, Machiavelli, Hobbes. I mean, all these people, they get inserted into his excerpts. So it's not just that he's copying, right? He's doing something, and he's inserting different languages in there. Because what he's wanting to do is, again, he's showing you the multiplicity of all these languages and the crisscrossing of all these languages. And so that in some way, what you get is, I mean, if you think about what's happening here, he's doing all these different positions that Montezuma had, and how they shift and different from language to language. And so we're paying attention to the role and place of the particular word in determining a rank, right? And so I think you have to pay absolute attention to, I mean, each one of these people are really paying attention to the language, right? The word strike, right, as a kind of general, that word was at times used in German for a strike, right? So meaning the general, because they take the language from English. So there's a lot of play in the book, crisscrossing of languages, because I think that in this instance, what you see, again, that he's making it almost impossible for you to locate something in one place. Right? I mean, so that, and he wants you to think about what that means. I mean, if you think about what it means in terms of the places that are being brought together, because each one of these passages are not only multi-temporal, multi-spatial, multi-geographical, multilinguistic, but what he's doing there is he's giving you an example of this growing commonwealth, right? And this is what, and one of the reasons he's doing that is because as he looks for all these different communal forms, he also tries to understand why they didn't survive, right? And there are two reasons that he gives. One is that they never joined each other, right? They never joined each other. So you have one community over here, one over here, one over here, and they didn't form coalitions. So that's one reason they didn't survive. The other reason is that even in these pre-capitalist formations, they had rankings and they had hierarchies. And that's the beginning of the end, right? So there's a really amazing moment where he's quoting Morgan. And Morgan is talking about how the Iroquois had invented a position for the chief that would be the equivalent of a general in our context. And he says, this is a great moment in the progress of history. He excerpts the passage, he quotes it, but instead of using the word great, he sticks in the German word for disastrous. So, you know, it's a way, he's not just copying, he's intervening. And he's giving you an example of the way in which you inherit language, but you intervene in it, and that intervention is already not just a reading, but a political act. And I think, I don't know if that crisscrossing, I mean, if you look at this passage, it's, I mean, multiple languages, the whole book is like this. You experience it like a Finnegan's Wake. It's like a Finnegan's Wake.
And of course, a third reason is because of the horrific barbarity of colonization and imperialism,
which is here too.
which is your second entry. So your second passage that you wanted to, or that you wanted us to.
Yeah.
So should we turn to that passage?
Yes,
and
we can.
What it was that you wanted to get out of that one?
What do I want to get out of that?
Yes. Which,
I mean, this is a moment where we talk about the Las Casas, and it's a moment where we link the Las Casas to Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation, originary accumulation, and of course, for him, capitalists think about this as the accumulation of wealth, but he wants us to think about it not about the accumulation of wealth, but the accumulation of violence, right? And he's using, among other references, Las Casas. He references Las Casas explicitly numerous times. And so this is a passage from Las Casas, from a short account of the destruction of the Indies, which was 1542. I see truly that what these two expeditions did in terms of evil, if it were possible to express and understand so much evil, so many ravages, so many deaths, so many depopulations, and so many and such savage injustices, they would terrify present and future centuries and would fill a grand book to the brim, because these exceeded all past and present, both in the quantity and number of abominations that happened upon the peoples that were destroyed and the lands that became deserts, because all of them were infinite. Now, the one thing I'll say is that the translations that are available for Las Casas are in general terrible. They're really terrible. So we retranslated the Las Casas passages. And this is a moment when, I mean, one of the things that Las Casas is doing is, of course, he's describing these horrific exterminations, violences against the indigenous populations in the Americas, right? And he thinks this is a total criminal act, but partly because he thinks it's a waste. Like he would rather not have this kind of accumulation of violence, but have to kind of undergo a different kind of violence, which is conversion. You know, that one of the problems with destroying these populations is you're minimizing the number of Christians you can have in the world, right? So he's an interesting character because on the one hand, he's documenting the violence and he has some kind of influence, let's say, although Benjamin has a nice reading of him in the next passage, which is part of the review of the biography of Las Casas. But the other thing is that what he's talking about in the passage is almost the impossibility of having a book that could have a language that could match the violence. The word infinite here is very absent generally in the English translations, but it's everywhere in the Spanish. And what's infinite is violence. I mean, almost every time he uses the word, it's linked to a kind of violence. And so what he's trying to think is, how do you write a book, this grand book? How would you write a book that could match that violence? Like, what would that book look like? And in some way, what we try and suggest is that what you see in that book, in that language, is the kind of dissolution, the breakdown of his language. He can't match. So that you get the, I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like Marlowe in Heart of Darkness. You know, how everything, you can't say it, it's infinite, you can't, I mean, it's inscrutable. And that's, you know, if it's inscrutable, you can't get there, you can't name it, right? But what he's doing here is trying to suggest, because he does, he conveys in the way that he can, the infinity of the violence, right? But at the same time, he doesn't think that a book can match that violence. So there's a way in which we were trying to track the breakdown of his language as he tries to do it, and that breakdown is his way of matching his incapacity to have a language that could be faithful to the enormity of the violence, right? And what becomes interesting is that you see Benjamin, whose antennas are always kind of extraordinary. He has this review of this French biography of Las Casas, and Briand is actually somebody who introduces Benjamin into France. He's one of the first people to translate Benjamin into French. It is very interesting to pursue the ways in which the economic necessity of a colonization that was not yet imperialist seeks its theoretical justification. America is an unclaimed good. Subjugation is the precondition of the mission. It is the duty of Christianity to intervene against the Mexica's human sacrifices. And you see what he's doing. He's ventriloquizing the language that justifies these things, right? So he's paying attention, of course, to the language. The theorist of state reason, who does not openly present himself as such, was the court chronicler Sepúlveda. The dispute that occurred between the two opponents in 1550 in Valladolid marks the highest point in the life and, unfortunately, the work of Las Casas as well. For no matter how close this man came into contact with reality, the result of his action remained entirely limited to Spain. After the dispute of Valladolid, Charles V issued decrees that abolished slavery, abolishing the so-called encomienda, the patronage, which was one of its most racist forms. Yet the same or similar measures had already been enacted before, almost with any success. And one of the things that he does, he says, this is somebody who goes against the violence enacted by Spain in the name of Christianity, and at the same time as somebody who's trying to, within Christianity, go against what Christianity is doing. And also making a case for Christianity, the expansion of Christianity, which of course in this case goes hand in hand with the spread of empire. But for those of you who read Benjamin and you think of him as a theoretician, a philosopher, and so on, these are kind of explicit anti-colonial, decolonial sentiments, right? And he's there. He's reading Las Casas, as this is 28, it's after he does One Way Street, it's after he's done the Trauspiel, which is also an analysis of sovereignty. So there are ways of tracking within Benjamin's corpus things that line him with Marx. And one of the things that I would say, as somebody who's been reading Benjamin for decades, the thing that was so extraordinary about returning to him in this context, in this constellation of figures, and this is a kind of lesson, again, on how you read and how you learn, is when you put figures in relation to one another, it changes the way you look at them. Right? So by putting Benjamin alongside Marx and Luxemburg, and all of a sudden you find passages, your antennas are looking for things that are just different. Right? And what I realized, and I will say this, and we say it in the book, Benjamin is an extraordinary reader of Marx, like an amazing reader of Marx. And very often he draws explicitly the line, every document of civilization is a document of barbarism. It's from Marx's Class Struggles in France. How's that? So, he's actually pulling language from Marx and ventriloquizing, again, practicing the art of citation without citation marks, right? But he does it, and so you have to read with your ears, because you have to hear the echoes, the way in which he's, again, massifying his language. The work of art essay, you remember, begins with Marx. Marx is at the beginning of that essay. Why? Because Marx is one of the great theorists of production and reproduction. Right? Okay. I know, I threatened to go on forever. Like a
No,
river.
not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I have two questions,
Yeah.
Janai. Why don't we take both?
Uh-huh.
Or, yeah?
Yeah.
Janai. Do you want to get the mic, though? Pass the mic down.
Thank you so much for your questions, though. Thank you.
So I am...
Flip it on. Flip it on. Push it towards you, the thing.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm a performing artist, and I was especially interested in the passages on page 288 and 289 about cultural capital. And I was interested in,
What capital? I'm sorry?
Oh, cultural capital, page 288,
Yes.
289.
Yes.
So when I read this, of course, I think about our present circumstances where culture, and again, I appreciate that it's in quotes.
Right.
I'm thinking of it from an artistic point of view.
Right, of course.
And I think, I look at this and think, you wrote this in 2023, probably in years preceding. could you have ever imagined, of course, then, a short, less than 2 years later, we would be in this position where there's a systemic attack on culture. Somebody mentioned Emily Dickinson.
I did.
Right. So just defunded. The Emily Dickinson Museum in the United States just defunded with a statement, from the administration that she is no longer culturally important to the United States.
And what's the reason?
Well, you'd have to ask the members of the junta. Yeah. But I think as an artist, I am very interested and concerned about what we can do now, in terms of praxis, how we can, act on the concept you point out here, the culture on strike.
Right.
How do we make sure that as the producer, we have an active role in preventing this systemic evisceration of, what is being valued, what's being funded, literally, and what's being canceled.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, this final chapter is incredible. My notes, even my friend here is like laughing because I have everything like highlighted in all different colors, and and I can't wait to read the rest of the book. But this especially speaks to me because I think about also what we were talking about, how like the Brecht quote about how can I as a performer or as someone who has an audience or students live in their heads as I am living in the heads of the art that I am interpreting, conveying.
Right.
So I wonder how this resonates with you today, less than 2 years later, as we're witnessing what we're witnessing, and if you have any thoughts about what we can do. I mean, certainly performers or couriers of culture can do to protect and preserve.
No, that's a great question. Look, I mean, one of the things that we're doing in the passage is, of course, the reason culture's in quotation marks is because we're also trying to go against a certain notion of culture, one that could be identified with certain kinds of nationalism, one that could be, and this sort of document of civilization linked to barbarism, culture. I mean, everybody, anytime you declare a culture, it's a declaration of war. Because then it's like what belongs, what doesn't belong, what is culture, what is not culture. So anytime you declare culture in a particular way, it often comes with a definition of barbarism or a definition of who isn't culture or not culture, right? So we're trying to rethink that in relation to, I mean, it's a kind of displacement. Culture on strike is another name for the Commonwealth, the Red Commonwealth, right? So what we're trying to do is think about what that would mean. Okay. So one of the things it means is that when you think about an individual, an event, a work of art, or you have to think about each one of those things as an archive of an entire network of relations, right? So this means, among other things, that you have to think about the connectivity of everything, the relationality of everything. And in fact, if you follow the logic of this book, you could never, ever say you're either with us or you're against us, right? Because everything is totally potentially complicit, marked, inhabited by what it tries to reject, and so on. And we can, actually, I could say a lot about complicity, and I'd be happy to give an example of that in a minute. But so I think that one of the things we need to do, and actually I want to say, especially to the students who are here, it is so important for you to be here, not because of me, but I mean, to be here in this university, doing what you're doing. I cannot tell you not only how moved I am by it, but how important the work you're doing is right now. It is extremely important to do the work you're doing. Right now, they want us to feel that it's hopeless. And, this is exactly why we need to keep doing our work. It has to be really good. And because the one thing they don't want from us is good work. And this is something that I just was talking with Peter Sellers, who is, of course, one of the amazing advocates for art and moral action, art and social action, how you read 18th century operas as windows into thinking about the refugee crisis or about, I mean, anything. I mean, how every one of these texts that belong to, let's say, the Red Commonwealth or belong to the past are letters to the future, right? So that this becomes a reason for returning to Dickinson. It returns a reason to returning to Melville, one of the great analysts of empire, you know. But you know, what I think is the first thing is to encourage the students to understand how important the work we do is. Always encourage them to, in this sense, there's no closure here, right? It keeps accumulating, it keeps multiplying, it keeps proliferating, so that reading, the practice of reading, is something that isn't closed, it's open, it's collaborative. And, you know, again, that if you don't form coalitions, you're going to go, right? So that it's extremely important to gather, as we're gathering here. I was saying to some friends of mine who I met just before coming over here that at this particular moment, gathering with friends around dinner is a political gesture, right? So I think that any art that is, let's say, worthy of name art at this particular moment is linked to a sense that artworks are, okay, you know what, 3 minute?
Yes.
Okay, 3 minute answer. Why does Benjamin write on the work of art in the middle, I mean, like on the eve of military catastrophe, right? Why does he write this essay from 35 to 39, can't let it go, 39 to 40 even. I mean, he can't let the essay go. Why? And why does he say, I'm going to develop a series of theses on the work of art that can be used as weapons against fascism? Extraordinary, right? Why? I'll tell you why. Because he's living in a moment when the German nation is describing itself as a Gesamtkunstwerk, as a total work of art. And what it's doing is attributing all the attributes that we normally attribute to the work of art, originality, genius, creativity, authenticity, to themselves. So what he does is he's scanning the landscape, he sees them doing that, and he says, okay, so I'm going to rethink our relation to these concepts and to the work of art, and I'm going to show the way in which every work of art is an archive of relations. It's a mass. He says it's mass-like. So it's not something that can be linked to the singularity of the moment which it's produced. It's not something that is authentic. It's not something that is original. It's a citation machine. If he can show that Germany itself is a citation machine, he evacuates Germany from its claim to be an original work of art, right? The pairing that you could put with that is Nietzsche's On the Use and Disadvantages of a History for Life. You can reduce that book to 2 theses. 1, Germany does not exist. And 2, Germany does not exist because it does not have its own proper being. Why? It's a citation machine. It's borrowing forms from Greece, from France, from Britain, etc. It's linked to, like, the Red Commonwealth, what Marx does in that passage, where he's bringing all these multi-geographical things into the same space, right? Look at Peter Sellers' work, right? I mean, he's drawing from, you know, Polynesian texts, Indian texts, Chinese texts, Greek texts. I mean, he's putting them all in the same thing because that's the way the world is right now. You know, you can click on the computer, and at one moment you're looking at something in the Ukraine. You click on the, and it's a fashion show. You click on it, and you're looking at a baseball game. You know, that's the way the world works, right? And so I think artworks that don't pretend that they're authentic, original, the result of genius, you know, that emphasize their relationality, their citationality, are worthy of, let's say, models for students as they think about their own relationality in the world. Does that make sense? I mean, and it's not, when Benjamin does that, when he goes after all those things, what he's doing is trying to change your relation to those terms, because he thinks that if he can change your relation to the language that you use, he can perhaps change much more than just language. He can change the relations in which we live. And that's the stake for him, right? That text is a training manual on how to read historically in a moment of danger. And believe me, we live in a moment of danger, right? Okay.
Thank you, Eduardo. Wow, that was powerful. Janai, could you pass the mic down to Ms. Gunn? Great, thanks. Muskan. Yes, give it a minute. There you go.
Thank
Also,
you.
I'm really close, so it's the others who have to suffer a little bit.
Well, thank you. I just read the last chapter, but it makes often a very lonely act of reading feel like much more. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. I was wondering, and there are glimpses of this throughout our conversation today about very realistically what's happening now in terms of if we rely on language as our connection and what relates everything to each other, what is the danger of that language being co-opted
Yeah.
and then being used for
Yeah, of course.
nefarious aims? And if I understand your thesis in the last chapter, you're drawing out the Red Commonwealth as being a deliberate act by all of these authors to link to each other and to give a message to the future about political practice and activism, etc. And the way that I'm thinking of this is, I don't know if you're very aware of fandoms. And so how fandoms work is we
I'm
have...
friends with Judy Butler. What a fan of
Perfect. So you know what canon is, and then
Yeah.
you know what a headcanon is. Like
Yeah.
this idea that fandoms as a collective think that there is something that is part of the story, and there's something that could be part of the story. And then there's maybe the author who decides, yes, I will tell you that this is part of the story, so it's part of the canon. And then there are some things that just people imagine it to be. So the other part of this that I was wondering, in terms of the language being co-opted and then being used against movements, is how do you decide what's part of the Red Commonwealth?
Yeah.
And are there ways in which we can prevent then such language being co-opted?
Yeah, this is a great question, and of course it's at the heart of the book, because one of the great things about, for example, Benjamin is one of the great analysts of the almost inevitability of political complicity. Right? And when he, in the thesis on the concept of history, when he has a very specific name for that thing, it's danger. Danger is a very technical term in Benjamin. Danger is the always present possibility that without your knowing it, you can become a tool of the oppressors. And one of the reasons that happens is because you use a language that isn't just yours. So that when you use a language that isn't just yours, you're not in full control over it. And so it comes with all these resonances, and so that it's never clear what you will do. Which is why I was saying that one of the ways in which he tries to minimize his being able to be instrumentalized is his language is absolutely citational. Right, so that it's so massive. And that's what the Marx passage from the Ethnological Notebooks. I mean, it's like, what would it mean to write like a mass? Like that. That's like writing like a mass. You could say that Marx and Engels were among the first people who tried to imagine what it would look like to write like a mass. And Benjamin enacts that in his writing because he thinks this will minimize complicity, or the chance of complicity. But that danger is always present, which is why it's called danger. I can give you this fabulous example of how hard it is to overcome this, I think. And then I'll say something just very quickly about language. I'm in a graduate class. I'll name the teacher. It's a class with Derrida. We're reading texts by German Jews between the two wars. And at a certain point, he says, what could anti-Semitism be if it were compatible with everything? If the moment you open your thought or thought a thought, you couldn't help but speak or think something that would be anti-Semitic. If this were the case, what could anti-Semitism be? Okay? So there was one student who referred to a particular Jewish group in Paris who had been trying to fight anti-Semitism. And so Derrida says, oh, well, we all know how at times Jews can be anti-Semitic. And then he gave a history of this group, which he knew, and he showed how certain things they had done to fight anti-Semitism had either enacted or provoked anti-Semitism. So then somebody in the back, actually Richard Rand, the editor of the first translation of Glas, says vegetarianism is something that could in no way be considered anti-Semitic. Derrida smiles, says, well, I've been thinking a lot about vegetarianism lately. A friend of mine just became vegetarian. Insofar as the Judaic tradition requires the notion of sacrifice on a formal level, vegetarianism is anti-Semitic. Okay, Now, this is kind of great because it doesn't mean, of course, every vegetarian is in advance anti-Semitic, but what it means is when you're over here and you think you're very far away from what you think goes in the direction of the worst, watch out, because the way you're thinking could have relays with the very thing that maintains and supports what you think goes in the direction of the worst, all right? So what he's doing is risking his engagement, Benjamin, his engagement with these issues and the possibility of being co-opted by using the language he's going against. Originality, authenticity, aura, right, aura. The passage in the work of art essay that talks about aura, you've got your valley, you've got your mountain, you've got the breathing of the air. That passage is a distorted citation from an earlier essay on the history of photography, where you again have the strange weave of space, mountains, summits, valley, etc., which is itself a citation, distorted citation from a passage of the last volume of Proust. Benjamin's translating Proust with Franz Hessel. So the very passage that used to talk about aura, authenticity, originality, is already a citation, right? That's extraordinary, what he does in that passage. But what he's doing, again, is he's taking the language that's there and saying, if you pay attention to that language, you then have to read it, but also know that you're using the language, and then how does he do it? How does he recontext? He moves that language through the essay so that by the time you get to the end of the essay, none of those words mean what you thought they were. Look, we're not lobbyists, we're not diplomats, but we're trained in reading language and images. Like, we're really good at it. And that's what gives us the right to enter the historical political domain, for the reason I said earlier. Nothing happens in that domain without languages and images.
Thank you, Eduardo. Maybe we could close then with the penultimate paragraph that you brought for us, in part bringing us to the late, well, possibly to the late Marx, or at least to themes from the late Marx. Themes from Rosa Luxemburg, who herself seems to have, very much like the late Marx, been attuned to the ecological crisis, and and so explore that passage.
Yeah.
And yes.
Okay.
And we've kind of got the ethnological notebook, so
Yeah.
they work together. Of course.
They do. And I just hope you also liked the Mexican Dreams, which are kind of fantastic.
Oh yes.
Yeah, but the Rosa Luxemburg, this is a letter to Sophie Libnik. The letters are amazing. Benjamin's brother, which some of you may not know, was a Spartacist, right? So he belongs to the group of Luxemburg and Liebknecht. He's a Spartacist. And he gives a copy of Luxemburg's letters to Benjamin on his birthday in 1920. So he has those letters before he writes The Critique of Violence, right? But this is a passage, it's a letter from 1917, and what we liked about it is that it's linked to a reading that we do of the Accumulation of Capital book and her analysis of colonization, empire, etc., which resonates both with the Las Casas and Marx on primitive accumulation. And what I liked about this passage is it's a passage on reading. Only yesterday I read why the warblers are disappearing from Germany. Increasingly systematic forestry, gardening, and agriculture are step by step destroying all nesting and breeding places. Hollow trees, fallow land, thickets of shrubs, withered leaves on the garden ground. It paid me so when I read that. Not because of the song they sing for people, but rather it was the picture of the silent, irresistible extinction of these defenseless little creatures, which hurt me to the point where I had to cry. There's a lot of crying in the letters. I'll get to that if we have time. It reminded me of a Russian book which I read while still in Zurich, a book by Professor Sieber about the ravage of the Redskins in North America. In exactly the same way, step by step, they had been pursued from their land by civilized men and abandoned to perish silently and cruelly. A gorgeous passage. Just as a parenthesis, because the ethnological notebooks are next, and the main part of the ethnological notebooks are his extracts from Morgan. Luxemburg reads Morgan's Ancient Society when she's 16 years old. Amazing, right? So what we liked about the passage, of course, is that it shows again that she's a reader. And she doesn't just read about nature, but she also reads about the extermination of the native population. She's also making a kind of relay, a connection between the violence and rapaciousness of industrial agriculture and the extermination of the native population, right? And you know, this is linked to a whole series of readings that we do in the Red Commonwealth, so you would have seen this. And it's linked very much to, I know that you in this series had Saito here not too long ago. So part of it is linked to a reading of Saito's work, where, I mean, and this is one of the reasons Marx never finished Capital, right? Because he's reading books in natural science, he's reading ethnographies, he really thinks that in order to do Capital, to finish Capital, he needs to know all this other stuff, right? And Capital is unfinished because he knows in the end, he can't do it by himself. Right? That's why these things are like a will and testament that he gives all to us to continue the work, right? But in some way, what you see here is a reading. She's reading. She's again the source of her political activism, her analysis, are the books she's reading, which I think is extremely important. And then that reading is linking her to her own reading of Marx. You know, this trope or I don't know, trope, this saying about how capitalism bears the seeds of its own destruction. You know, in Marx, it's really totally concrete. I mean, you're raping the land, you're robbing the nature, and so you're lifting, extracting all the minerals, all the nutrients, everything, and you're not replenishing, right? And if you don't do that, eventually, he says, quoting Justus von Liebig, who was this guy who writes on agricultural chemistry, he liked the 1862 edition, the 7th edition, that one he really read a lot in 1865, 1867, because that's when Liebig talks about the robbery of nature. And so Liebig says at a certain point that if you don't replenish what you're taking out of the land, you will have plagues and wars and everything that we know we see today, right? It was already there. But what you see here is just sort of the germ of I mean, they were already there at that moment, right? They're already seeing and scanning the landscape that we know so well now, right?
Thank you, Eduardo. I think maybe we'll give the closing words to Brent Edwards. We're privileged to have you here as well. So let me pass the mic to you.
Did you have your hand up, dear, or are they just putting you on the spot?
I didn't have my hand up, but I will accept to be put on the spot. I didn't necessarily need the last word, though.
The lesson of the book is that there is no last word, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, to return to the question of translation, your answer to that, one thing that I'd add is that it's important to remember that Benjamin was a translator.
Yeah.
And that task of the translator is the preface to a translation. He's a practitioner.
Yeah.
I've been writing, or trying to write, about C.L.R. James's masterwork, Notes on Dialectic, which is produced out of a collaboration and a collaborative reading process between James and his collaborators in the Johnson Forest tendency during James's US period. And it's a translation exercise. C.L.R. James is in Nevada trying to get a divorce from his first wife so he can marry Constance Webb. And he's writing to a person you quote a lot in the book, Raya Dunayevskaya, and Grace Lee Boggs, saying to Raya, I need this translation of Lenin, send it to me, because Dunayevskaya reads Russian, James doesn't. Writing to Grace Lee Boggs saying, I need you to translate this passage in Hegel. I need this passage in Marx. Can you send it to me by next week? Because I've got to figure out what he's doing here. You can't pretend that reading politically is absent from or elsewhere from translation.
Absolutely.
The politics of translation is at the center of what it means to read politically and to read collectively. And what's striking about this tradition is how cognizant all these great figures are of that, the politics of translation. So just, this is more a word of praise that in the book, you are so aware of the politics of translation, not just with that one word in the Mexican dream, but throughout, you're thinking very carefully about where is this coming from, et cetera. I'm not sure it's a closing word, but I wanted to bring up a section that hasn't been brought up, and I know that that the whole book was not assigned, but I love the chapters about a third of the way, halfway through. One is called Benjamin's Boxes.
Right.
And
Right.
then there's one called An Unusual Pedagogy,
Right.
the following chapter.
Right.
The Benjamin Boxes one is primarily the one about Klee, about the Angelus
Right,
Novus.
exactly.
But I guess the way maybe it is a closing gesture. One of the things that's remarkable and awe-inspiring about this book, and ironic in its own way, is to produce a, 400-page book.
Where the footnotes are a third of the book, but in really tiny.
Well, that's what I'm thinking about. Not just the beauty of the book, but the form of the book, the way you put it together. It's ironic, but lovely to allow what was supposed to be a book review, but morphed or metastasized,
Right.
as the verb may be,
Right.
into a book, primarily concerned with one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century, but as Jameson writes about, with Benjamin, the amazing thing about Benjamin is that One Way Street is his only book. Right?
According to Jameson, yeah. Peter
Well,
Fenves thinks
it's an
not
important,
even a book.
Right. But that's what's interesting about it, that your book is interestingly a book in its form.
Right.
And to me, it's not just that I love what you're doing in those chapters with Angelus Novus, but it becomes a model for thinking the book as a series of boxes. This is on 148.
Yeah.
This is why we might say Benjamin's boxes and figures are more militant than antiquarian.
Right.
They are all elements of a pedagogical impulse that he develops and enacts throughout his life, an ever-widening constellation of emblems that require an exercise in the reading of history as an enigma.
Right.
And what I love about the way you put the book together is not just that it's a physically, materially beautiful object, beautiful to handle, but that you've created these kind of boxes that one can move into and then expand from in, as you're saying, a perpetual, ongoing series of readings after readings after readings. So it's it's 10 times as big as One Way Street, but it's coming out of that Benjaminian
tradition,
militant box thinking.
Right.
And I love that. I don't know if you have a comment about that, but I just wanted to say that about the structure of the book for people who haven't read the entire book.
I mean, I think part of it, I can say that the attention to the figure of the box, the first sort of, let's say, I mean, Sara is the one who said, oh, it's like a box. And then Mr. Expansion, I tracked every box. I just started looking for all the boxes in Benjamin, right? And the reading of the clay, I think, I'm really happy with that reading. Some of you may know, the clay which Benjamin owned, right, the Angelus Novus, what he describes as the angel of history, his description doesn't match what you're looking at all. But it's been shown that that monoprint is actually on top of a kind of reproduction, engraving of a portrait of Luther from the 1520s. So Clay knew what he was doing. Like and Luther is not just anybody, right? Luther writes in theses. Benjamin writes in theses. And so when you say that the angel of history is looking, he is with his head, he's backward, right? And people talk about the backwardness to the future. But actually, if you think of the piece itself, his back is looking at another form of reproduction, which is totally interesting, right? But yeah, there was a sense of it was a box, and then I just start tracking boxes. And we really liked the image of the box, and I'm glad you mentioned it because it is like a box. I mean, there's a way in which, I don't know if we could do this, but there's this gorgeous moment at the end of the preface to Anne Carson's beautiful autobiography of Red, right? And she is taking all these fragments of Stesichros, 6th century BC Greek poet, which she then retells in the 20th century I could tell you more about that, but the main figure that I'm talking about here is at the end, she imagines a book as a box with all these fragments. And she says, here, shake. Which is to say that you can, and I don't know, I suppose you could probably read them in different orders, right? Yeah. You don't have to read them in sequence in some way. At the same time, what we realized when we read the whole thing out loud at the end, it was amazing how it is cumulative. The argument is totally cumulative. And even though we didn't plan the order, it really works. Like there was somewhere in which that whole thing was in our head, and in that collaboration, this is how it unfolded in some way. But in a subsequent book, you all know maybe Anne Carson's Knox, which is a book that comes to, it's a book that she writes after the death of her brother, and it's basically in a box. It's a box, and you open it up. It's like a coffin, really. You open it up, and then the book is an accordion. It's all the folded pages, and I don't know how many meters it is if you spread it out, but it's like this is another instantiation of the book as a box, right? And the kind of movement around this. And that book is like a coffin. Yesterday, Peter Sellers read a Chinese poem from a collection of what's called, unbelievably, coffin-pulling poems. Amazing phrase. And maybe with the closing of that lid, we can close the session.
All right. Thank you so much, Eduardo.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone,
for
your questions.
And thank you, Bernard, for your invitation.
You're more than welcome. Thanks, Brent, for joining us, everyone else as well. Thanks, Ricardo, for organizing everything. Thanks, Reno, for all the AV work. And we'll be back next week for Marx 1213 with Bruno Bastils. And we'll be looking at the French Commune. Okay? All right. See you next week.